Hello and welcome. We're just waiting. We were waiting a few minutes because we have a group that was scheduled to come today, and they may not be making it. So we're going to get started, and if they come in, they can join us as we go. So first of all, I would like to welcome you to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple. I'm the director of the Old State House. And as always, we were thrilled to have you here for our lunchtime program. I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're doing this program today. Sometimes we go to the far past for our programs. This time we're going to our more recent past. And I just wanted to share that I grew up hearing my mother talk about visiting Front Street when she was a little girl in the 1930s. And I was always intrigued by this little patch of Hartford that somehow just disappeared. I had no idea where it went. I just knew it was gone, and I knew Constitution Plaza was in its place. And what I knew about Constitution Plaza is one of my earliest memories, because I remember going to Constitution Plaza for the lights to come on the day after Thanksgiving, and I loved that. And I loved that for a really long time, from the time I was really little till when I was pretty old. In fact, my first date with my husband, we went to Constitution Plaza to see the lights. And even today, I meet friends at the fountain for lunch. So it's a place that's always been near and dear to me, but I never knew much about the history of Constitution Plaza. So when I met today's speaker, and he said he had done a paper on Constitution Plaza and its history and Front Street, I nearly jumped across the table. I was really excited about that. And one of the reasons I was excited was because it has a place in my personal memory and my family memory, but also because we're on the verge of so many exciting and interesting things in Hartford and in a lot of cities around the country. And I thought about Constitution Plaza and the changes it brought to Hartford, and I think about iQuilt and the very different way it's going about bringing change to Hartford today. So I thought this would be a really good moment to talk about Constitution Plaza. And to help us with that today will be Diane Smith. She will be moderating our panel and introducing our speaker, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming her today.
Thank you for coming today. We're very glad to have you here. I should mention that this program is being taped by CTN, so it will be seen both on the air and it will be available for people to look at on our website, which is ct-n.com, so you can look for it there. And I wanted to also invite you, if you have a moment, we have our farmers market going on. Please stop by the farmers market on your way back to your offices or wherever it is you're going next. So I thought it was very interesting to talk about what happened with Constitution Plaza and how it came to be. And we thought it would be a timely topic, but really it turned out to be a lot timelier than we could anticipate. I have to be honest with you that we planned this program weeks ago, and so it was a little bit jarring, I guess, and kind of interesting that yesterday the Hartford Courant reported, and it was Keith Gosselin, one of the business reporters, who reported that the largest chunk of Constitution Plaza has gone into foreclosure. And as he explained it, after an agreement to refinance a $60 million mortgage couldn't be reached. Now, I should say that Richard Weinstein of Weinstein and Wisser in West Hartford, who represents the owners of that portion of Constitution Plaza, said that far from being a troubled property, following extensive renovations and leasing to several marquee tenants, I should point out that this place has a very healthy occupancy rate and is not a troubled piece of property. In fact, the occupancy rate well above the rest of the city at over 80%. So he feels optimistic that something will be worked out in terms of the mortgage. There's no doubt that Constitution Plaza today is not the same place that our first speaker came to visit when he was a child. It was the first major urban renewal project in the city, and as you'll find out, the planning and development of Constitution Plaza took over a decade, and a few times it looked as though it might not happen at all, but I'll let Jason tell you about that. The land was cleared in 1959. Construction continued till 1964, and as we all do know, I think this project forever changed the face of downtown Hartford, really dramatically changing its landscape. But I'll let an expert tell you that story. Jason Scappaticci is the coordinator of transitional programs at Manchester Community College. He has a BA in history from Utica College of Syracuse University and a master's in American Studies from Trinity. His master's thesis is a compelling account of the redevelopment of Hartford's East Side, including Constitution Plaza. So please welcome Jason Scappaticci.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here today. I love talking about this. I studied it for over a year, so I could talk about it for about 2 hours, I'm sure. I won't be doing that today. However, I do want to talk to you about why I got interested in it. I thought I'd open up with that. Similar to Sally Whipple, I have childhood memories of Constitution Plaza. When I was 7 years old, my father worked at the Travelers Insurance Company. And with my older sister, we were taken to go see the lighting of Constitution Plaza for the Festival of Light. And I remember just this spectacle of an event. We had not gone to Hartford very often. I grew up in Manchester, and so my parents really didn't take us into Hartford. They saw no need to do so. And so when we went to this magical place, which was in the center of a city that I had only ever really driven through, I was just fascinated. This plaza was full of people. There were vendors selling all sorts of things that, children would want, that my parents wouldn't buy me. And they had a reception for us. Travelers had a reception for their employees in the hotel, which is now, of course, mothballed. And I remember eating lots of cookies and drinking lots of cocoa. And to me, this was almost as though Disneyland was in the middle of Hartford. I was just thrilled with this place. And I'll never forget the moment that they flicked on the switch and all the lights went on around us. And then, to top it all off, folks, Santa descended in a window washing unit. I mean, this was just the be-all and end-all. So that was my introduction to Constitution Plaza. And then some years later, when I was a college student, I was interning for a political action group in Hartford, and they sent me to Constitution Plaza because there was a protest that was going to take place nearby, and I had to go there and drop off some supplies. And I didn't quite know how to get there. And my friend John, who I worked with at the Connecticut Citizen Action Group is the name of the organization, he said, "Oh, well, you're going to go to Constitution Plaza, where they ripped the heart out of the city." And I was intrigued by this because my one experience of Constitution Plaza was a thriving place. It was exciting. And so I went to Constitution Plaza that day to drop off the supplies, and what I found was a barren, hot, concrete plaza with some anemic planters and a fountain that was not working. And I was so disappointed, and I was intrigued. And so when the opportunity came for me to do my master's thesis, I knew that I wanted to do it on Constitution Plaza. I always wanted to know more about this story. Is it as cut and dry as they ripped the heart out of the city? I think that you will find that it isn't. Many have the perception today that it was a land grab by the banks and the insurance companies of Hartford to take land from a poor neighborhood and redevelop it. And I think that after the talk, you might think a little differently about that. Constitution Plaza was contested when it was built. It's still contested now, but I do think that the story speaks for itself. So we're going to explore that a little bit today. Now, I want to start by showing you the area that I really focused on in my studies, and that's the area, if you can see it on the screen, it's in pink. So it's this area here, which is basically between the Founders Bridge, just about there, which is not in this map. This is an old map of Hartford before redevelopment, and the Bulkley Bridge, which is right up there. So that was the focus of my research. And what you'll see in the map is that it looks quite different from today. Urban redevelopment in Hartford took a city that was much more reminiscent of downtown Boston, if you will. If you've all driven through downtown Boston, you know what I mean, right? It's charming, but it's terrible to drive through. It's kind of like one big inside joke, and you have to live in Boston to get it. But the downtown Hartford was once very similar to that, and urban redevelopment wanted to make the city more car-friendly. This was the 1950s and 60s, and that's what they did. So many of the streets that you see on that map are gone forever. Are Ferry Street, Connecticut Boulevard, Kilbourne Street, Kilbourne Court. Charles Street is still there, but it's really a remnant of what it used to be. So instead we have modern city blocks. Also observed to the north, in the Windsor Street area, that was another major urban redevelopment area. That's where the Crown Plaza Hotel is today. Travelers has a data processing center there, or at least they did for quite some time. And there's also much empty space there today because, unfortunately, it was never completely redeveloped. But you'll notice that the streets up there are really a tangled mash of old streets. It's an old city, and that has been totally redeveloped into a modern city with modern blocks. So this is the focus of my area of study. However, it started, of course, much different. This is a map of Hartford in 1640, and downtown Hartford was originally planned out, of course, as a farming community. You probably know the story of Thomas Hooker leading the bands of Puritans from Massachusetts Bay Colony to Hartford. So just to get you a point of reference today, right here in the center, this space is called Meeting House Square. That's where we are today. So that's where they built their meeting house, eventually where the Capitol building was built. And over here, where Constitution Plaza sits, is left totally undeveloped by the Puritans. And that's by design, and that's because the Connecticut River has a nasty tendency to flood every spring. Of course, the Puritans didn't have the technology or really the will to try to prevent the floods, so their solution was to not build on the flooded area. And so they didn't. And we'll talk about that a little later because the flooding does continue right up and through the 20th century and has some pretty disastrous effects on the Front Street area in 1936. So they left the entire area undeveloped. But I think what's important for us to know and to think about is that eventually this changes. Hartford, of course, changed from a farming community to a commercial community. And that's because at the time, for the ships that they used, the Connecticut River was not navigable, I always have trouble with that word, as far up as Hartford. So what would happen is farmers would send their supplies down the Connecticut River on barges from further north in western Massachusetts and Vermont. They'd send the supplies down, the crops down. They'd get loaded onto ships here, and then they'd go down Connecticut and out to the markets in New York, perhaps in Boston as well. Water, of course, in the early part of our country was the most efficient way to move goods, and so Hartford was really well located to take advantage of that. So we turned from a farming community into an industrial community and a commercial community. And what that meant was that the east side, or the little meadow as they called it, the Puritans called it, was developed. So warehouses were built, docks were built. And by the late 1800s, we had a thriving city, and the little meadow, which flooded every spring, was completely developed. Now, what that also means for us, and just as a point of reference for you, in this map, here we have the old Oakley Bridge before it burnt down, and the Capitol building where we are today, the old State House, is right there. And Constitution Plaza is right here today. So, what that means for us is that the Connecticut River is the front door of Hartford. The east side is the front door of Hartford. And for the purposes of why do we care about that, it's because this means that if you're an immigrant and you're going to Hartford, this is your first stop. So, naturally, the east side of Hartford saw waves of immigrants settle into these buildings that were originally the homes of wealthy Yankee traders. The traders tended to build their houses near to their commercial establishments. However, as they became more prosperous and as more and more immigrants started to settle into Hartford near them, they moved out to more comfortable addresses such as Farmington Avenue, Asylum Hill, and they turned their old houses into tenements. Or sometimes they ripped down their houses and built tenements on their property. So the east side of Hartford saw successive waves of immigrants, beginning with the Irish, moving on to the Polish, Jewish, Italian, and just before urban redevelopment happened and relocation happened, Puerto Rican and black families were settling in the east side of Hartford for the first time. Now, by 1890, about 1/4 of Hartford's entire population lived in this small area of Hartford on the east side. It was the most densely populated place in Hartford, and conditions were so poor that a 1903 national report on housing in American cities said for its size, Hartford has the worst housing conditions of any U.S. city. Now, of course, with the population, unfortunately, there were a certain number of vices in the East Side, and this is one of the things that it was known for right up until the time that it was demolished in the late 1950s. Prostitution was very common along the East Side. 1892 report by the charity organization Society of Hartford said that 10 out of the 12 known brothels in the city were in the East Side neighborhoods. Also, the former Bainge mansion, Frederick Bainge was a wealthy trader with the East Indies and the West Indies. He moved out, of course, to a more comfortable address, and his mansion got turned into a tenement and eventually got turned into May Howard's Place, a brothel, which was known as the most reputable house of ill repute in Hartford. So if you were somebody, that's where you would go. River House was located right along the river, as the name implies, and that was a thriving brothel from the 1800s through the early 1900s. I did have the opportunity to interview people who lived on the East Side, so I did a number of oral histories, and folks that I interviewed did remember this seedy side of the Front Street area. Somebody that I interviewed said, "Yeah, we saw a lot of nasty things. You used to go down the alleys between the apartment buildings in the back where the porches hung over, and let me tell you, you could see some of the crudest part of life that you wanted to see." So I think we certainly remember fondly the community, and we will talk about that. However, it did have other reputations as well, and well-established reputations. Gambling was also something pretty common. There were gambling dens in the East Side. This was recalled by folks that I interviewed as well. One fellow, he grew up there as a child. He was an Italian-American. And he described that a group of the men on Saturdays would form a crap game in the schoolyard of the Brown Street School, a Brown school that used to stand over on Market Street. And he was sent as a child up to the roof of a nearby building. And he said, "Now, I would sit up there, and they would be having the crap game below. Now, I was paid to go up there, and when the cruiser of cops were coming with the wagon, I would tell them they were coming. So by the time the cops got there, everything was cleared off, and the guys were standing around smoking." So, these are charming stories, but they also were breaking the law. And certainly, this, as I said, is one of the reputations, unfortunately, for the East Side. Now, this is a view of the East Side from Temple Street, looking east to Front Street. Front Street, by the way, is Columbus Boulevard today. Just for those of you who aren't aware, it was renamed Columbus Boulevard eventually. So, as I said, the land owned by the East Side by former wealthy commercial traders, they eventually built buildings like the ones you see here, tenements. So it was a mixture of their former houses, and you can see that here. So in a former house, and mixed with industrial buildings, commercial spaces below, tenements above. Many of these buildings were still standing in 1958 when the demolition took place, and they were remembered by the folks that I interviewed who grew up there. Cold water flats was frequently used to describe them. One fellow I interviewed said they were kerosene-heated flats, and they were railroad apartments. So you had one stove in the kitchen, and the rest of the house was ice cold. Toilets were outside. It was just a little room with a toilet in it, and that was all. And when you had to take a bath, you would use galvanized pans and a sit tub to take a bath in. However, there also was a public bathing facility for the folks who lived on the East Side, since most of their flats did not have bathrooms in them. That was located on Connecticut Boulevard. So there was a public house, bathing house there. And the folks that I interviewed also remember that. One fellow, Frank, said, "We had no shower, we had no bathtub. There was a public bath on the boulevard. It's no longer there today. There used to be the bathhouse there, and we used to go there. Most of the time, my sisters would not go, though. They would wash in the stone sinks in our apartment." He remembered that it was 5 cents to get towel and a soap at the bathhouse and take your bath there. So the conditions were one of the things that were touted by redevelopment as one of the needs to redevelop the area, was because of the conditions that existed. These were, keep in mind, happening in the 1950s. They said that this was one of the reasons why they should take down the buildings and start over again. This is a slide of Talcott and Front Street. And it's a market on Talcott and Front, an Italian-American market. Now, despite the rougher, seedier side, it of course has a very positive reputation today. Many people fondly remember going down there. One of the people I interviewed said it was colorful. A lot of people. It was wonderful. My mother could walk down the street and everyone knew her and would call her name. The apartments were nothing, let me tell you, but they were welcoming. They would invite you in for coffee and you would yap around the kitchen table. You went down to Front Street and you knew that it was very friendly. Others remember the food that they saw. I also interviewed people who didn't live in Front Street, but lived in other areas of Hartford, who were not Italian American. So what they remembered is the ethnic food, stuff like spaghetti, which of course is very common to us today, but at the time was considered an ethnic food. A number of people who did not grow up Italian, did not grow up in this area, but grew up in Hartford, told me that this was the first place they ever saw a pizza pie. And that they remember the spectacular spaghetti and pizza palaces that they would eat at with their friends when they were younger. So there certainly is a positive side of Front Street. And that's, of course, what they're trying to recreate today in the new Front Street redevelopment. They're thinking about the community that existed there. I don't think that they're trying to tout the gambling and prostitution in the new Front Street redevelopment. Now, what's important to remember, so we have successive waves of immigrants using this area, absentee landlords. We have a reputation as a fun community, colorful, welcoming, and friendly, but we also have a reputation as breaking the law, too. One of the things wasn't an issue in the 50s, but certainly was in the 1920s. This was also a hotbed for illegal booze making. Of course, with Prohibition, that was a very popular business. So this is all located, though, right in the shadow of the downtown business district. So here we have Kilbourne Street, which is gone today. This is in the 1950s, and you'll notice Kilbourne Street is still paved with cobbles. Cobblestone still paved it right up through the time when it was redeveloped. So all of this is within view of the downtown business district. So you can see Travelers Tower right back there. And by the 1950s, things were starting to change for this area of Hartford. By the 1950s, we have huge industrial losses in Hartford. From 1947 to 1956, Fenn Manufacturing, Hartford Machine Screw, J.M. Nye and Company, Allen Manufacturing, and the Fuller Brush Company all left the city. So we have a huge decrease in the jobs that once supported the population that lived here, and this population is also moving out. In fact, industrial employment decreased by 18% throughout the 1950s, from the end of the war through 1960. We have the phenomenon of white flight. So the white population was leaving downtown Hartford and was being replaced with minority populations. And also, we have a huge change in the federal government. And that was when President Truman endorsed the Housing Act of 1949. And the Housing Act of 1949 was a huge game changer for redevelopment in Hartford. And that's because Title I provided money for slum clearance, federal money for slum clearance. And more important, it also allowed the city to take property by eminent domain to take federal money to clear it and then to resell it to a private developer. So this is really broad powers that are given to them. Now, besides losing industry and population, they were also losing insurance. In the early 1950s, Cigna announced that they were going to be building a large suburban campus, which you can see today, outside of Hartford, and they were taking their entire business outside of Hartford. So it's really important, I think, for us to look back on this and think about what the planners of the time were thinking, because they see population decrease, industrial job decrease, and then, to top it all off, insurance is leaving the insurance city. So imagine what that meant to them. So they felt that they had to do something. So 1 year after the 1949 Housing Act was passed, the Hartford City Council created the Hartford Redevelopment Agency. It was created on April 24th, 1950. This agency acted quickly. They had their first meeting less than a month later, and they designated 6 areas in Hartford for redevelopment and for further research on redevelopment. And though these 6 areas comprise less than 5% of the city land, they held over 15% of the housing in the city, which is interesting. So they're focusing on areas of cramped housing to be redeveloped into other uses, or perhaps in residential and commercial uses. So after more research, they narrowed this down to 3 areas for further consideration. The East Side site, which we're talking about today. The Windsor Street site, which I pointed out to you earlier, which was eventually redeveloped in the 60s. And Upper Park Street. The Hartford Redevelopment Association, or the HRA, applied for additional money, $21,000 from the federal government, to do further development on this area. And the federal government said, no, you must choose a site now. We're not giving you any more money for research. So with that, they chose East Side, and the stage was set for the redevelopment of the East Side of Hartford. Now, it was not as cut and dry as all that. East Side was chosen in 1951. The first shovelful of dirt didn't happen until 1960. There was a decade of stalling, delays, and controversies that happened in between that time. Planning continued for 6 years. 6 years. While they fought a court case against eminent domain, and also haggled with a church called St. Anthony's Church, which wanted their property preserved. St. Anthony's, by the way, is still in existence. It's now St. Patrick's St. Anthony's. After years of negotiation with the Hartford Redevelopment Agency, the Archbishop ordered St. Anthony to combine with St. Patrick. So all of their negotiation was a moot point. They were going to save the church for them, and then in the end it was demolished along with the rest of it. The city council finally got a ballot on a referendum on the ballot in 1956, and it was overwhelmingly approved by the citizens of Hartford. By a 4-to-1 margin, redevelopment of the East Side was carried. Now, as I said, things progressed pretty slowly between government bureaucracy, the court case, and the haggling with St. Anthony's Church. It was some 6 years, and still nothing had happened. No people had been relocated, and no buildings had been demolished. What finally galvanized the leaders of the city and the population was an event on June 27th in 1957. And that was when a Front Street apartment building collapsed. It literally collapsed into the street. Nothing happened to cause it to collapse. There was no storm. It was a quiet evening. It was around midnight. And literally the facade and the front rooms of this apartment building just gave way and slid into a pile of rubble in the street. It was occupied. Fortunately, nobody was killed. It was a miracle that nobody was killed. 8 people were injured. The youngest survivor was a 13-month-old who was found in the rubble of her family's apartment, still in her crib. Many of the survivors described it sounded as though it was an earthquake or a bomb going off. And so this really galvanized the city to finally start to move forward on redevelopment. So whereas they had been dragging their feet before, now they were going to do something. And so after that, things started to move much faster. In the summer of 1958, McGraw was named the developer, and Clifford Strike, the director of McGraw, is located on the right side of the screen. And on the left side is the architect, Charles DuBose. They completed designs by November of 1959 for the redevelopment, which you can see in front of them there. And they began attracting tenants. They had a deadline to buy this property from the city for $2.8 million. City began demolition and began relaying the roads and laying sewer pipes and things of that nature and the power system. And they also had to find a loan of $50 million to build the new development. Unfortunately, the late 50s were also a time of economic slump. There was a small recession at the late 1950s, and McGraw was having an enormously difficult time finding the money to build their new development, which they had designed. So they missed their first deadline to buy the land from the city. The city extended the deadline to December 1959, and McGraw missed that one as well. They went as far away as Great Britain to find a bank to finance their redevelopment, and it failed. So they were getting very close to failing to purchase the land and being out as a developer, and it looked like the city might be left with 6 acres of vacant land and nobody to redevelop it, when Travelers Insurance Company was asked to step in. So one of the common myths about it today is that Travelers wanted it from the start. Travelers was asked to step in to save it at the last minute. So Travelers stepped in and actually broke their in-house rules. Their in-house rules said that they could not invest in a redevelopment or a development unless it had 60% commitments of tenants. And at this point, Constitution Plaza did not have anywhere near 60%, but they stepped in and agreed to finance it. So here we have an article from the Hartford Times when they agreed to finance it. So on January 29th, 1960, agreement was reached, and 2 days before the deadline, the land was purchased by Constitution Plaza Incorporated, and they agreed to take part of the project. Construction started, but delays continued to hamper them. As I said, it was not a smooth sailing for them. So to tie it into the overall East Side scene, which is still controversial today, people say it is not successfully tied in. They delayed it. Finally, though, land did get broken on April 14th, 1960, and here you see a wonderful shot of construction of Constitution Plaza. The first building to be built was the Broadcast House, which, interestingly enough, was the first building to be demolished as well. Here we have a slide from 1961. So as you can see, the Phoenix building is rising in the back. That's the steel skeleton that you see here. We have 100 Constitution Plaza nearly done, and 1 Constitution Plaza, you can see the steel skeleton just sticking outside of the corner there. And these buildings are going to be razed momentarily. They're going to be ripped down. They're abandoned at this point. The plaza was finally finished in the summer of 1963 at a cost of $35 million. It won a national award for the city's solution to urban blight. It won an award for that. And it is still controversial today. Some people say that it saved the city. Other people say that it destroyed the city. Some people say it's a monstrosity in the middle of the city. I think it is important to remember that it was part of a larger redevelopment scheme that was never constructed. So it was part of this large scheme. Here we have Constitution Plaza. They planned on making a large pedestrian mall here out of Main Street and create a shopping area. They planned on building a convention center up here, parking garage there, and a walk to work, which was eventually built. That is Bushnell Towers, which was the walk to work scheme, which was built for the wealthier, so they could walk to work. And the federal building was built. Down here, though, none of this was ever built. This is the Riverview housing. This was the middle-income housing. This is great. You're going to love this. The reports recommended that this housing be marketed to the pre-breeders, the post-breeders, and the non-breeders. So I guess that's young married couples without kids yet, the empty nesters, and those of us who have chosen not to breed. But that was their middle-class housing that they wanted to feed the plaza, which, of course, was not constructed. So I'll leave you guys with that. And where's my mouse? Let me put up the slide of the completed Constitution Plaza for our backdrop. I will just get the slide up and you can take over.
I'll ask the other panelists to join us now up on the stage, please.
There we go.
Okay, there it is.
Thank you, Jason. That was
Thank you.
While they're getting situated, I just want to let you know that when you leave today, out on the desk, we have a nice walking tour of Hartford Moderns, which includes the Phoenix building. It's a great walking tour, so be sure to pick that up. And also, in our lower level, we have an exhibit about Hartford called History is All Around Us, and you'll see part of the Constitution story, Plaza story down there. And now Diane.
Thank you, Sally. I'm glad that you're able to be with us today. I want to introduce the next two people who are on our panel. In the middle here is Christopher Wigren, who is the Deputy Director of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. He's an architectural historian trained at the University of Virginia. He edits the Trust's newsletter, Connecticut Preservation News. He manages its preservation easements program and teaches continuing education classes for real estate agents, among many other responsibilities. You may have read his numerous articles on architectural topics in the Hartford Currents Place section, and Chris is currently working on an architectural guidebook to Connecticut, so thank you for being here. And Thomas Dellar, on the end there, was selected as Hartford's Development Services Director in April of this year. Tom has more than 3 decades of experience in planning and urban development and was most recently Director of Planning and Development in Providence, Rhode Island. He has a bachelor's degree in urban studies and a master's degree in community planning from the University of Rhode Island. Thank you both for being with us. Jason, I have to say that I have been covering the news in Hartford and other parts of Connecticut since the mid-1980s, and that is the best explanation I have ever heard of what went on with Constitution Plaza, and really that was just terrific. So I'll give each of you just 30 seconds or so to say, the two of you actually, to add to what Jason said in the question he posed. Did Constitution Plaza rip the heart out of Hartford, or did it help the city? Chris?
I think it may have done a little of each. Clearly, Jason made it very clear that the Front Street area had a lot of problems. And a lot of American cities did. They were, on top of everything else he described, they were coming out of a period of disinvestment or de-investment with the Depression and the war, when nothing was built, nothing was maintained. And the pressure of development and automobiles and modern life clearly needed to be addressed. I think that cities are like ecosystems. It's like when you start poking around in a pond or something, you never quite know what the consequences are going to be. They're living things. And I think that's what happened with a lot of urban renewal programs. They didn't understand the ecosystems. And building a city or even a neighborhood from scratch is a really, well, it's probably an impossible thing to do.
Tom?
Well, I'll have to agree with Chris. I think that it probably did both a little of saving and a little of damage. And I think that we came out of World War II and everything that was old had to go away. We had to be modern and new and be the superpower that we were. And with the advent of the automobile, we had to think about how these cities became more functional. And that was an era, that was a time. And I think that we're looking back now and realizing that a lot of what we did had good pieces to it, but a lot of it was bad. And we have to try to think about what is a city. And a city is people. It is the people who are here. And how do we make a city comfortable and enjoyable for those people so they can raise their family and recreate and have a job. And I don't think that developments like Constitution Plaza and many around the country really thought about that. It was get rid of the old and make the new.
It's interesting because, as Jason described in his explanation, and Chris, I think you could back me up on this in terms of New Haven as well, the idea of making a city car-friendly was something that was very popular at the time and is almost exactly the opposite of what we talk about today, isn't it, Chris?
It is. I think there's a happy medium. I mean, I've talked to people who remembered taking an hour and a half to drive through New Haven on the narrow streets like you had here or you have in downtown Boston. And, Route 1 went through the middle of New Haven. And so everything that was going from New York to Boston had to go right to the middle of downtown. And the people who were working there, that already our society was a very automobile-centered society. And so that became a real issue.
I think that it's interesting that when I read about why they planned Constitution Plaza the way they planned it, they wanted to elevate it to keep the pedestrians away from these nasty cars, So let's create, in a sense, two cities. We're going to have a leveled city, right? We're going to have the cars down here, and we're going to have this lovely place for people up here. unfortunately didn't work the way that they thought it would. But at the time, it seemed like a really great idea. Let's try to make both areas happy.
Well, there was a comment from Bill Foudy. He used to be the director in this building. And he wrote a piece a couple of years ago where he said that many people refer to Constitution Plaza as a failed urban renewal project. But he said if it had been built the way it was intended, it would have been a brilliant success. Tom, is that the case?
It's hard to say. I walk around Hartford, and one of the things that stuns me is how so little attention was paid on the street level to the pedestrian. You have garage doors and back doors and no glass and nothing that makes a person feel comfortable. Constitution Plaza was elevated to separate the people from that, but that doesn't necessarily create safety or a comfort level. So unless you were to raise all of the city to that level, I don't know how it would have in the long term been a success.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
It certainly could have been better. I mean, the idea of connecting what was going on in Constitution Plaza to Main Street that Bill talked about in that article clearly went to addressing one of the issues of Constitution Plaza, which is that it's turned away from the city. It turns its back. It's very inward focused, which probably was partly what even the best of intentions had in mind, creating this sort of intimate, pedestrian-friendly, don't pay attention to the rest of the city kind of enclave. Almost maybe something more like a better version of it is Pratt Street now. With that it's got that sort of identity as a place of its own.
Jason, was there an opportunity because of the style of Constitution Plaza to build architecture that otherwise might not have been appropriate or might not have fit in to the landscape and the urbanscape of this city?
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that they were excited about, was that we're going to have these ultra-modern buildings to replace this this kind of old-style brick. Now we're going to have glass and steel. And they got an award-winning architect to design the Phoenix building, which was just was a very exciting building at the time, the two-sided office building, right? And of course, even today, I think that's probably most people's favorite building in Constitution Plaza is probably the Phoenix building. But the architect who worked on that worked on Rockefeller Center, another very famous urban redevelopment that was, most people say, done right.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Phoenix building because so many people here, it must have been controversial at the time. I think that something as dramatically different from what people's eyes were accustomed to, Tom, that must have just, to plunk something like that down in the city now, could you do it today?
Well, I think there's a very different attitude about design today than there was in the 50s. I mean, as we both spoke earlier about the coming out of the war, everyone wanted new and bright and different. I think there was a big effort to do things that were very different and in some ways jarring. And people were more, while they may be questioning about it, were somewhat accepting. If you tried to do something like that today, the question, well, it's not brick, it doesn't have pillars, it doesn't have defined windows, and how can you do that? And so that you have that kind of debate and controversy. And I think that it was because of the radicalness of the 50s and 60s of what happened in design that kind of debate and discussion happens today.
Chris, it strikes me that building, which most people in Hartford would call the boat building, that building was a signature piece that at the time you would see from the highway, once the highway was fully constructed. You don't really see it as much now because of new development, the convention center and the science center. But there was also a signature style building in New Haven that I think was meant to say, hey, look at us. Look how modern we are. Look how new we are.
Absolutely. Buildings as billboards for not only for their company but for the whole city was something you see in a lot of post-war urban redevelopment programs. The Phoenix building was very definitely intended to serve that purpose. Constitution, the rest of the towers as well. In New Haven, you're probably talking about the Armstrong Tire building, the Pirelli building, the building that stands on stilts above the lower section. But, you also the Knights of Columbus building in New Haven. The idea, again, it was that progress was important. It indicated that you were vital, that you were going places, that you were lively, that you were making money, that you were modern, that you were up to date, and you wanted to show that to all the people whizzing by on your new fast highway. So these buildings are really built as much for the highway or more than they are for the street, which is why that they don't work quite as well sometimes from the street vantage point.
I do want to invite the audience. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you, and Paul Scaff will come to you with a microphone. Yes, sir?
Yeah, one of the questions or problems that I see for any city is the competition from the surrounding towns. Rather than a Constitution Plaza ripping the heart out of the city, I look at it as people left the city. There was a development of the urban mall, which to me put a curse, a pall on many cities. And in Connecticut, since we are a very independent people, 169 towns going back to the colonial era with very little cooperation. So how does one overcome that to bring a more coordinated sort of development? I mean, it's very, very difficult, but that's something that's always puzzled me. How do you deal with that question?
That's a very interesting question. Tom, would you like to take a crack at that?
That's a question I've been struggling with for years. How do you deal with that problem? And there is one solution. You do what they do down west, and you annex and make it part of your city. I do remember a mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, explaining how whenever he needed to raise his tax base, he just annexed that industrial park outside of town, and it made a difference. So we struggle in the Northeast with a very different system of government that really makes it difficult for us. And I think that cities didn't think, they were so busy thinking about what was happening in the decay in the 50s and 60s, they didn't think about the fact that we're losing jobs, we're losing retail, we're losing what makes us a city. And today, with the suburban community starting to realize that what they're calling the new urbanism, that what makes you strong and vital is a retail center, job centers, they're starting to get ahead of us and beat us at that own game. So we have to sit down and think about what makes Hartford special. What can we do that will bring people here? What can we change? And there's always the balancing of the taxes you need to raise to pay for schools and this and that you have to balance those things. But think about it. We have Interstate 84 and 91. Somewhere between 150, 170,000 vehicles a day go through that intersection. There's got to be a way that this city can capture some of that to have some value. We need to think differently about how we do things. I've been here 3 months. My first week at work, I decided to go the way I drive every day in the afternoon, and I got around the block and realized I couldn't go straight anymore. Even though my office was 2 blocks that way, I had to go around and around and around. We've got to be logical. We've got to think about what are the things that help us frame the city. The city is working on something now called iQuilt. I look at that as a framework document that helps us think differently about the city and how we grow and expand. And it talks about walking, it talks about our culture, it talks about our innovation that happened here and how we can build and grow off of that. But unless the state were to step up and say, okay, we're going to reduce the number of communities and these 4 communities merge together, we're going to have to constantly think about how we work together to make a difference and create vitality.
Tom brought up the topic of iQuilt, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but what it really raises is the issue, and Chris, I'll ask you about this, of how urban redevelopment is different today, how the projects today are different from those projects in the late 50s and into the 60s.
I think that we've mostly, not entirely, but mostly learned one of the key lessons from urban renewal is tearing everything down and starting over from scratch doesn't work. The exception in a lot of people's minds is things from urban renewal, but but I think that's a key point. The lesson not to blame the buildings, to think that this is a bad neighborhood, there are things going on that we don't like, therefore we'll tear it down because the buildings are at fault here. And so those are 2 sort of starting points. And then finally the concept of adaptive use, where you take old buildings, old neighborhoods, old constructed areas and modify them slightly to meet new needs, but realizing that you're never going to have a perfect fit, so you don't really go for a perfect fit, but just keep on living and working and hoping that things will grow and that, as Stuart Brand wrote in his books, buildings will learn as they go along.
Tom, I want to give you an opportunity to talk just a little bit more about iQuilt and how, as opposed to Constitution Plaza and some of these urban redevelopment projects where it was knock out a neighborhood and put up everything new, iQuilt is dramatically different from that.
It is, and I think I want to start off by saying that one of the things you have to recognize about cities is that we're messy. You know, we're not neat blocks. Here's where people live. Here's where people work. Here's where people shop. We're messy. We're all together. And so when you think about that, the iQuilt sort of took the concept of connecting people from point A to point B, to getting them to walk through these connections, to think about what is our culture, what's creative that we have happening here, our historic buildings, our art galleries, everything else that we have, and trying to think about that, and then think about the people, the creativity that's come out of the city, the innovation, the things that are happening, and try to build off of that. So iQuilt looks at connecting the waterfront to the state capitol and how we move between those two places in downtown and from the north to the south as well as the east to the west, and how we connect all the different things that are in the city so that people have a sense of the quality of the city and the beauty of the city. And it calls on us to make a series of improvements. Now, what are the things we have to address? The bus system. We have a bus system that if you come from the west east and you get to downtown, or you come from the east to the west, the two bus systems don't connect. There's a gap in the middle. And so if you want to go from West Hartford to East Hartford, you got to get off and walk a series of blocks. We have to think about that connectivity. We need to reduce the idling of buses on Main Street so it's more friendly to the people. So there's the bus piece. There's roads and how we improve the pedestrian realm and create better streetscapes. There's improvements to our parks. Along that is thinking about housing in the downtown and trying to build a strong downtown neighborhood and community. And so the retail, it's the cultural aspects, linking them together so that people have an understanding of all the different things that are happening. So it's that kind of framework document.
It struck me when I first came to Connecticut in the 80s. My husband and I were coming here from upstate New York, and we had a boat. And we were very excited. We were moving to New Haven, and we were thrilled. We thought, well, we'll be living right by the water. We'll have our sailboat. We had a little sailboat. We'll dock it right near where we live. And there was no place to do that. The city was almost entirely cut off from the waterfront. And I found the same thing when I came to Hartford. The city had no real relationship at that time to the waterfront. And I thought, these are some of the strongest reasons to be here. Because to me, I love being by the water, and that's such an asset. And yet we had almost, I guess deliberately, cut ourselves off from that in two major cities.
I think you look historically in New England, most of the cities grew off of the water, but yet we turned our backs to them. We covered. In Providence, we covered the river. Right. You walked across what was a bridge, but you didn't know it was a bridge, and there was a river there. And so cities today are starting to rediscover. We have river recapture to try to get us back to the river. And we need to think about the importance of that river to the history of the city and how we connect back to it and how we enjoy it.
If anyone in the audience has questions, yes, there's a woman in the back there who, Paul, if you can just come to this lady right here. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to point out that Hartford did it again twice. Not only Constitution Plaza, but again, that was probably a neighborhood that needed to be redeveloped, but just across Market Street, which is now State House Square, had a number of small shops, and it was always very busy. There was a lot of people going in and out of those shops. And they redeveloped it, and as far as I can tell, it is not as bustling as it used to be in terms of commercial ventures there. I mean, commercial shops. And the same thing happened on Main Street, where it is now the Gold Building. Again, there were some small shops, one of which, by the way, was a market. I know there was the development of that new market that didn't make it. Because I feel it was in a very bad location. The market on Main Street was very small, but it was always crowded because it was right near where people needed to have it. So I think people, when they think in terms of cutting the heart out of the city, they think of what are they going to replace it with? Just glass and steel? and not have things that are available for people to use.
Well, that's interesting, Jason, because part of the initial development of Constitution Plaza was that it was supposed to incorporate a lot of merchant activity into the whole design of it.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, in one of the earlier plans for the plaza, the skyscrapers were supposed to be half residential, half commercial. And that was cut rather quickly because they realized they wouldn't quite make as much off the residential as they would off the commercial, and it was a lot to maintain, or there were problems with that. But that was one of the original proposals, was the top halves would be residential.
How fabulous it would have been to live there.
Right, yeah. And then you could take your elevator down to your office, and then down, it's hidden by one Constitution Plaza, but back in there is a shopping arcade, which did have shops in it. However, the shops eventually all closed by in through the 1980s. And one of the things, when I talked to people who used to live there, I said, well, they did put shopping in, because they said that, they took out all these buildings with shops. And I said, well, they did put shops in. They said, well, right, but they were expensive shops. We couldn't afford to go there. We moved and stayed in Hartford, but we couldn't afford those shops. So it was marketed towards a different clientele in some places as well.
Chris, it's interesting because, I'll get to you in just a minute. Chris, I find it interesting that one of the big factors in this redevelopment was the concern of businesses moving out of the city, including Cigna, which set up what became a really iconic suburban campus. In touring the Cigna building recently, or the campus, which has been somewhat restored, they took shops with them. There is an arcade of shops in that building, including things like a dry cleaner and a shoemaker, which are things that people need if they're going to live in an area. They took those just for people's workplaces. Wasn't that an attempt to recreate what they had in Hartford?
It was, absolutely, yeah. The idea that you could duck out on your lunch hour and pick up your dry cleaning and get your hair cut and buy a few things. And that was one of the problems Cigna encountered. We're going to lose our workforce because they won't be able to do all this stuff. And so they had to build that into it, which, probably turned out being very inefficient and very costly for Cigna, because I'm sure they had to subsidize the businesses.
Interesting. I think that you had a comment here in the front row.
Echo the statements about the cost of the shops. Because in the early 70s is the first time I really saw Constitution Plaza. All the shops were not what I wanted, because I don't want to spend the money. And it isn't that I don't have money. Even now I'm like that because I travel. And I have been, I've been married 40 years right now, and we have spent at least 8 years traveling. This is for teachers that didn't have to work in the summer, didn't want to, didn't work on weekends, and didn't work after school. So you want to keep it everything basic, cheaper, not dirt cheap. But those shops in Constitution Plaza, forget it.
Interesting. Henry Link right behind.
Hi. As the fellow in the back was asking what some of the solutions was, as we saw in the 2 storms last fall, regional cooperation and sharing is one way of doing things better, and not only for efficiency, but also just for general well-being. And development, I feel, should be somewhat shared also with more authority for the Capital Region Council of Governments to help oversee, and then have, because they have input, the board of the Capital Region Council of Governments is made up of town officials from all over the 29 towns in the region. And I feel that that's one help that would take care of some of the problems.
Tom, will that happen? Does West Hartford or another outlying area want to help downtown Hartford?
Well, I hope so.
It's cutting right to the chase.
Unfortunately, we all sort of struggle for the almighty tax dollars to support the services that we are required to supply. And I think that the urban settings suffer because of the amount of land in a city like Hartford that doesn't pay anything in taxes. So that we actually have a tax base that, while we may be 18 square miles, I think about a little over 50% of that doesn't pay anything in taxes. And so it's hard for us to balance. And in many ways, cities take those things that no other community wants. We deal with the poverty. We have the tax-exempt hospitals. We have the things of that nature that everyone in suburbia sort of, they use the hospitals, they take advantage of that, or they look at us and you can have the social service agencies and everything else. So urban settings take burden on that other communities don't. So we hope that they're willing to help us because we're helping them by taking care of those needs. But there does have to be a thought process, I think, in the New England area about how we as cities and towns will survive in the future because of the cost of the services that we have to supply. We can't do it under the system that exists today.
We need to get those pre-breeders and post-breeders as well as the non-breeders. Chris, I'm going to ask you for a perspective on some of the other cities in the state and whether any of them have successfully overcome that issue that cities have. I'm thinking in particular about New Haven because there is so much of the city that is now owned by or operated by Yale University, which is also a tax situation.
It is. As Tom said, it's the nature of cities, I think, in general. Yale in New Haven is, it certainly does occupy a lot of tax-exempt land. It's also a great attraction for New Haven. So it does contribute a lot to the city. And I think you'll find that, in general, the nonprofits, a lot of them, the museums, the things that serve a diverse variety of people, in a sense, they cost money, but they also do contribute to the life of the city and to the liveliness of the city.
Does anyone else have a question? This gentleman right in front. Okay, Paul.
Just a few comments. First of all, one of them is directed to Jason. First of all, I enjoyed your presentation immensely. Other thing I wanted to mention, there was a retired employee, either from Aetna or Travelers, named Tony Allen. He's a singer, and he has a CD out that's been out for a while called I Remember Front Street. So it is phenomenal. That's the first thing. Second thing I'd like to say also is that I have wonderful memories of going to Constitution Plaza, going to the bridal party penthouse looking for bridesmaids' gowns and bridal gowns and having lunch. I believe it was the Hobnob restaurant. And on a humorous note, years ago, the Hotel Sonesta used to be the Hotel America when I was growing up, and then it became the Sonesta. And I had wonderful memories of having lunch at the Rib Room, which was a very popular restaurant in those days. But on a humorous note, if you had a family function like a wedding or something like that, the ballroom in the Sonesta had a very funny beam that went down like in the middle of the ballroom, which came from absolutely nowhere. And that was a place, if you had a guest list and you had relatives you didn't care for, you put them behind the post. So when you would go to a family function, you'd look at the post and say, oh, who was there? I guess they're not in good with the family. So on a very humorous note.
How can you get this gentleman's comment?
Have you noticed any changing in the thinking? Because it seems like a lot of mistakes are made by popular acclaim. For example, covering up the floodplain. Boston, they leave it out so you can see the river, be connected to the river, and they didn't try to develop it. But I understand that there used to be a group called the Bishops, and that they did things. Have you seen any change in the thinking between then and now that might offer some hope for Constitution Plaza?
For our television audience who is all over the state, let's explain who the Bishops were.
Yeah, the Bishops were, they weren't a formal group, but they were a kind of the CEO of CBT and Travelers and Aetna and the Hartford. They were all, at the time, local companies. They weren't part of national conglomerates or anything like that. So these guys had enormous power and influence, and they coordinated with the Chamber of Commerce director, Arthur Lumsden, and they got stuff done. I mean, that's essentially, he's the guy who stepped in when they couldn't find funding. It was Arthur Lumsden, director of Chamber of Commerce, who went to the CEO of Travelers and said, hey, we have a problem, and I know Travelers has plenty of money, and you got to help us out. Mm-hmm. And they did. That's how the Civic Center got built in '74. That was Aetna. That was another insurance company stepping in and doing it. So those are the Bishops. But on the note of, I just want to throw this out because I didn't put it in my presentation. I should have. I just want to point out that in 1936 there was a disastrous flood that flooded almost the entirety of downtown Hartford, with the exception of this building. Mm-hmm. The flood went as far in as Bushnell Park. So Bushnell Park was underwater. So I really think it's important that we also consider the mindset of the time. Mm-hmm. This was the river that flooded our city every year, and then in 36 caused millions of dollars worth of damage in the midst of the Great Depression. We don't want anything to do with that anymore, thank you very much. And that's when the Army Corps of Engineers came in. They built the dikes along the river. They blocked the river off. They were happy about it. That was, by the way, like I said, the Army Corps of Engineers, that was a project that went much better than New Orleans, fortunately. So the dike system worked really well here. It worked too well, maybe, right? Because we couldn't even see the river for a long time. But I just think it's important that we know that. And I encourage you all to look up some pictures of the 1936 flood because it's really astounding what Hartford. The flood waters reached as high up as the second floor of the buildings down around here.
We're just going to go for about 5 more minutes. But Tom, to get back to this gentleman's question, have someone's replaced the bishops in helping projects to move forward?
I think there's still as I said, I'm new to Hartford, so I'm still trying to figure out who helps us make the projects move forward. And I think right now, in this day and age, it seems to be government. I mean, there is partnerships with the chamber and other groups, but the major funding has either come from the federal, state, and in some cases the local government to carry things out. The projects aren't as big, they aren't as daring as in the 30s, 40s, 50s, but that's who's doing it now.
Can we take one more question from the audience? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Tom, I think it's very clear that you have the most difficult job in the state. But I encourage you to see through the cynicism. I think one of the biggest problems that we have here is that there are so many cynics. And I hope you know that there are people rooting for you. So we all hope you are successful. Secondly, one of the big mysteries of downtown, at least to me, is how many people actually live here. Who are the people who are choosing to live here, and how are they speaking? Are you in touch with them at all and have any comment there?
That's a great question.
There's, I don't know how many units there are downtown right now, but I will tell you that when I moved to Hartford, I tried to find a place downtown, and there weren't any available. So I know that what's here is full, and I'm trying to get an understanding of that. The crowd downtown seems to be mixed between, what do we call them, the pre-breeders and the post-breeders? So it seems to be mixed like that. There are some blogs and some Facebook page and others where people express their views and opinions, and they do meet. I'm trying very hard to get out and meet people and understand what they're thinking, because I think that in many ways a job like mine is trying to understand the views of the people, try to help shape their views, have them help shape my views, so we're doing the right thing. But I think that one of the problems the city suffers, and this is one of the last points I want to make, when you take an office building and you convert it to housing, you got to understand that when it was an office building, for every 1,000 square feet, you probably had 10 people. When it's a housing building, you have one person. So you've just changed your density and the amount of life you have in a city. So you have to have far more housing to offset the amount of office spaces coming out. So we need to think about how we grow that density downtown. And as far as cynicism, I can be a cynic too, but I came here by choice. I had a great job in Providence. I didn't have to come here. I looked at this city, I looked at the opportunity, I looked at the things that are happening. I say, there's a great group of people here between the state and the city trying to make a change. I want to be part of that group and help make change.
Tom, I think I have to echo what he said. And I hope you do feel that you have a lot of support, because in spite of that cynicism, there are a lot of people out there that are rooting for Hartford from all over the place, not just from inside Hartford. Thank you so much for your comments. Chris, would you like to have one last comment? And then Jason?
Gosh. This is the historian in me. We talk about urban renewal and everybody immediately thinks 1960s, but urban renewal has been going on for a long time. The Emperor Augustus bragged that he found Rome as a city of brick and he turned it into a city of marble. John Nash and the Prince Regent rammed Regent Street through London. Baron Haussmann redeveloped Paris. In Hartford, Bushnell Park was an urban renewal project to slum clearance and create a park. So cities grow and change, and that's part of what attracts us to them, I think. They're always something different, always something new to experience. And part of that is where we've come from, and part of it is where we're going.
Thank you, Chris. Jason, you have the last word.
Most exciting. Well, I would just like to thank you for joining us today, and thank the audience for coming. I thoroughly enjoyed presenting to you all, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well. And I'm not saying that Constitution Plaza is awesome. I'm not saying that it's terrible. I'm saying that it's one of those gray areas. And I know that we like things to be either black or white. It's easiest that way, right? But I'm saying Constitution Plaza, I think, is kind of one of those gray areas. And we have to think about that and, maybe go a little softer on our harsh criticism of it. And it's really important for us to remember the mindset and the culture of America at the time.
Jason, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here today.
I'd like to thank our speakers, and again, thank the audience, too, for coming today. We'll put some links up on our Facebook page today for some of the things that you heard about today, some of the books that were referenced. And again, I remind you to please go to our lower level at some point to see the History is All Around Us exhibit, which was put in by the Connecticut Historical Society. It has a great history of the city and a little bit on Constitution Plaza. Thank you, and thank you again to all of our participants.